Julia Rogers is an experiential education expert and accredited gap year counselor with more than 12 years of experience in the field of emerging adulthood. As the founder of En Route Consulting, based here in Vermont, Julia oversees a social enterprise dedicated to fueling the gap year movement and developing a generation of compassionate, driven, and resourceful global citizens. Julia works with educators, service learning organizations, nonprofits, government entities, and families to develop creative educational pathways that result in young adults being better prepared to succeed in college, life, and work. And now I am going to go ahead and pass it off to Julia. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I am going to take over. I'm going to start driving the screen as well, so now that we are off, I will say a full screen hello, and then now I'll share my screen again. So thank you again for being here this evening. I'm just so delighted that BSAC invited me to speak again about the gap year option. So as Anna said, I am a professional gap year coach and counselor based here in Vermont. I work with students all over the country and even internationally, and focusing on really helping students design personalized gap year plans and opportunities. So that sometimes means connecting students directly with programs, or sometimes it means helping students self-design gap year opportunities for them, but it always means helping young people better prepare for their next step after their gap time. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on tonight, and I'm just delighted to be able to share my knowledge and wisdom with parents and students here who are thinking about this as a strategic move after high school. I am also the president emeritus of the Gap Year Association, which is the nonprofit governing body of the kind of the gap year space here in the States. They accredit programs. They also conduct research, and that's where I'll be drawing a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you tonight. So the Gap Year Association is a fantastic place to also continue your gap year research and education. So first things first, we're going to talk a little bit about a working definition of a gap year. Depending on where you're coming into this knowledge from, whether you have another young person in your life who you know who's taken a gap year, or you're kind of coming in fresh, it is important that we have a shared language around what a gap year is. So I like to define a gap year as a structured period of personal growth aided by activities of enrichment. So that's a little bit vague, but also specific. So, really what we're looking for with a gap year is the opportunity for students to explore and learn about themselves, learn about the world around them, but really making sure that it's intentional and that it is more of a bridge. When we think of gap, sometimes there's a connotation of someone, woo, like falling into an abyss. That's not really what we want to build here, right? We want students to think of a period of time, a designated period of time, as a rite of passage before starting the next stage. And I will sometimes refer to the next stage being college, but obviously a gap year can be used as a bridge to vocational school, community college, the military, straight to career. It's really a natural pathway for no matter what your higher education or post gap year path will look like. So conversely, let's talk a little bit about what the gap year isn't. A gap year is not the absence of a choice. And I think that's a really, really important distinction to make for people who are new to the gap year concept. A gap year really is supposed to be intentional. And while it can mean different things for different students, as you will soon learn, that just the diversity of what you can do with this period of time is, infinite. But it is supposed to be, the structure of it is supposed to be that is deliberate. So if a student graduates high school, doesn't have a plan, kind of just lives in their parents' basement, just kind of futzing around, that's not a gap year. That's something else that we aren't going to be discussing tonight. So everybody should now go into this period, into this next part of the conversation, understanding that the main, guardrails of gap time are that it is typically several months to 2 years in length, that it should be mentored, or there should be mentors involved to help the student grow as much as possible, that it should be anchored in goals, and that there should be some things that the student is trying to work on either personally, pre-professionally, or just having some other personal things that they're hoping to achieve. So those are kind of the things that the qualities that we're looking for within gap time. But then the things that you can do with a gap year are really, really varied. So I'm gonna, well, we don't want to look at the dog anymore. So I'm gonna skip to the, I do want to run this poll by everybody. So I'm gonna launch this poll. Please, please read it and participate in it, because I want to know what everybody thinks is the most important qualities needed to be successful in college life and work. And we'll see kind of where everybody falls on this. I think that, you know, at this day and age, the job market is really changing, and what employers are looking for and what the skills that young people come to college with are sometimes different. So that's, I think, a challenge that we're facing in higher education, as well as what young people are facing, is how do I acquire the skills needed to be successful once I either start college or career or whatever that educational step is. So we've got about a little bit more than half are voted at this point. So if you want to participate, give a click. Right now we're, yeah, all of the above is strongly trending, which is not uncommon. So, so yeah, we've got about 70–80% voted now. So wonderful. Thank you so much for helping make this presentation a little bit more experiential, which is really important when we talk about gap years. So yeah, I think I do agree with the majority of people here. I'm going to end that poll now. So as you can see here, yeah, 84% of you said all of the above, and then kind of an even cut of some of the other ones. So oops, I should probably stop that. So I'll stop sharing that so that you can focus on the other thing on the screen. So there are a lot of skills that students need to be successful. College isn't great at developing all of them, and high school isn't great at developing all of them. So, you know, fill in the gaps, right? You know, pun intended. And really, when we're looking at what students get out of gap time, no matter what they do, we find that they get a lot of clarity about their next steps after their gap time. So, you know, 88% of them say, this is self-reported data. So 88% of gap year students say their gap year increased their employability due to soft skills like increased communication and leadership ability. 84% say that they developed the skills needed to be successful in college and career. And 60% of them say that that their gap year set them on their path for college major or career. So collectively, this is really, really powerful information. There's also a stat that I didn't have room for, but I think it's 81% say that their gap year gave them a competitive edge in the workforce as well. So, you know, when it comes to strategizing, how do we get our students to be as prepared as possible for the workforce? A gap year can be a very powerful tool in this because it gives students soft skills. And that's really what a gap year excels at: developing leadership, developing sense of self, developing confidence. And we'll see that a little bit on this next slide, because I think that the other side of the coin is that a gap year and the space and experience that a gap year provides allows a student to really blossom and feel much more in touch with themselves. I think that especially this year, students have been spending way too much time, you know, in their insular environments and not getting into the real world and being able to develop as much as usual. But even in normal years, students are often too busy to develop, to really look at their genuine development and say, who do I want to be as an adult? And what kinds of things do I want to experience that aren't related to trying to get into college, that aren't, you know, that aren't part of my own environment. So, you know, 98% of students say that their gap year helped them develop the ability to interact with people across different cultures. Keeping in mind that that does not mean that they are going to the ends of the earth on their gap year, that this does not mean that they are even going outside of their state. Across cultures basically means different lived experiences. And I think that the ability for us to understand and empathize with different people is incredibly important at this moment in time. And that is also a very highly coveted quality in the workforce as well. Um, 98% of gap year students say that their gap year helped increase their maturity and confidence. I think that all the parents on this call would probably love it if their young person felt more mature and more confident going into higher education. And then, 84% say that they naturally developed more academic motivation as a result of their gap year. And why that happens kind of depends on what type of student they are. So I'll describe that in a minute too. Because I think that the other kind of surprise for a lot of people is that different types of students take gap years for different reasons. And knowing these different profiles in very general terms can help you identify as a school counselor or as a parent if your young person could be a good candidate for a gap year. So I'm going to kind of go through each category and give you some of the characteristics of these different types of students, knowing that obviously students contain multitudes and this is not a perfect representation of any one person. But a worker student is going to be your high test score, high GPA type of student, naturally inclined to work, also maybe has a tendency to overwork themselves. These are students who tend to feel burnt out by the end of high school. So they use a gap year to recharge, to explore other areas of interest that they haven't had time to explore during high school, and to take a little bit of a breather before probably going to a more competitive college environment. Our meaning seeker is the type of student who typically has high test scores and lower GPAs because they are very bright, but they need to have that drive to do well. They need to want to do it. They need to be interested in doing it. They're not going to just do the work because it's school and they should. So what these students really gain on their gap time is perspective. Oftentimes they'll explore career opportunities or just get a better sense of what they're good at. And then when they arrive at college, they enter kind of with the ability to see the forest for the trees and know that they have to do college right to get to where they want to be afterwards. So that's really the value add for these students. Our floaters tend to be students who, for whatever reason, have never really excelled in the classroom environment. They could learn differently. There could be other factors at play. But these students really need to develop their motivation and their interests on their gap time. So they need to develop a reason for whatever their next step is. And sometimes they need to develop some more personal responsibility as well. So those students often thrive in more structured environments where a lot is demanded of them and where they are able to learn a lot of those skills needed to be successful in the next steps. Our pragmatists are the kinds of students who really understand that higher education is expensive and that they want to come into that experience knowing as much as they can about their career path or just feeling like they're really ready for it. A lot of young people say that they're ready for college, but internally they know that they may not feel really ready for that experience. Pragmatists are self-aware enough to say that, and they use their gap year to help prepare themselves for higher education. Oftentimes that means exploring different careers, working, maybe saving a little bit of money for college, that kind of thing. Our adventurers are the kinds of people who have been really tortured this past year, not being able to move and see new places and meet new people. They're the kinds of young people that really thrive on new experiences. And they really kind of want to take a bite out of life before settling into a more structured higher education experience. And our soul searchers, lastly, are students who have struggled with mental health challenges or any other even physical challenge that has impeded their high school experience. So a lot of times, and by physical, I mean something like a post-concussive disorder is something that I see a lot in students where they have a challenge that is going to prevent them from having a really successful launch into college or the next step. So they take their gap time to heal, to develop strategies, tools, to, again, be ready, to feel ready for those next steps. So they are often also doing engaging in opportunities that are structured, that have a lot of support, that offer them the space to get what they need to feel good. So as you can see, there's probably a lot of Venn diagram students, who you can think of who kind of cross over in different categories. But this is hopefully a framework to understand why different types of students can really benefit from gap time. It's not really just for one type of student. So now the exciting thing, how do you plan a gap year? Because it's much different than the college planning process. It's actually refreshingly different from the college planning process for all of my parents of juniors in the room right now who may be feeling a little bit anxious about that coming into that process. First of all, for all my parents of juniors or juniors in the room, you can kind of take all this information in, but don't feel like you really need to apply anything to gap year planning really until next year. So you really start this process of planning a gap year during senior year. If you're college bound, usually waiting until after those college apps are out the door. So that's kind of, second semester senior year. Really around now is when most gap year students really sit down and say, okay, what's my plan for a gap year? And when that happens, you really want to start by this year, especially setting realistic expectations. Not everywhere in the world is going to be available to a gap year student who wants to travel this year. But the good thing is that a gap year does not necessitate huge geographic shifts. You can have really fantastic gap time in your own community, in your own state, in your own region, etc. So when we think about a gap year, oftentimes there's a visual in mind of a student with a backpack in Europe or Southeast Asia or something like that. And it's important this year that a student comes into the planning process understanding that there's a lot on the table, even a surprising amount on the table, but maybe not the entire world. And then the next thing that's a crux of a gap year planning process is identifying goals. This is really what makes it a more intentional process, because every student is going to want different things out of this time. To give you the quickest way to do this exercise, I would say that I subdivide the goal setting into 3 categories, the 3 Ps: personal, practical, and professional goals. So if a student can identify 1 to 3 things in each of those categories, you'll have a bit to draw from when it comes to researching what opportunities are going to be good for them. So personal goals are things that they just want to experience. Maybe the student is into photography and wants to dedicate a little bit of time to diving deeper into that interest. Maybe they want to try something new like surfing, or they want to go someplace warm, which is very common with my Vermont students. They oftentimes want to spend a good part of their gap year someplace warm and skip our winter. Then there's the practical goals. These are the life goals. These are life skills goals, adulting things. Have students who want to learn how to budget, who want to gain independence, who want to, get their driver's license. So these are practical life things that we all need to learn to really be successful once we are on our own. And then there's the professional goals. This is, again, those that when you're brainstorming with yourself or with your child, you can really think about like, okay, well, what careers are you a little bit interested in? Or if you have a thought about your career path, like how can we get you an internship in that industry? Or how can you do a job shadow with someone who does that kind of work? How can you do as much as possible on your gap year to collect clues about what your career path could look like? Knowing that career paths go like this. It is not like a straight trajectory. Everybody, who has a couple years under their belt in the real world knows that. So we just want to collect more about what lights your fire is really the best kind of information you can gather on a gap year. So after you identify some goals, that's when you can research. And there's lots of ways to do gap year research. There are gap year fairs that are virtual as well as in person. There are websites that you can look at, like the Gap Year Association, and there are people you can talk to. So there's lots of people in our own community in Vermont who've done gap time, or adults in your life who have backpacked or done other cool things, or maybe who work in an industry that's of interest to the student. So these are all, types of research that you can do when you're thinking about how to frame out the whole year. So then you create a list of, top options, whether that be a program or an idea or, a section of the year that is going to be dedicated to one thing. Then this is the crucial 2021 to 2022 caveat. You want to think about your plan B. If you can't go to, Tanzania on your gap year this year, like what's the plan B that you could still check off one of those goals of your gap time by not going to that place, but still being able to do it either closer to home or maybe virtually. And then you can really start to put together a plan. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't realize about gap time is that you can actually do more than one thing on your gap year. In fact, most people do. So you can almost think about it as divided up into seasons. A lot of students will work during the summer after graduation, go away to do something in the fall, come home for the holidays, and then go off and do one or two more things before the following summer. So it's really a lot of time that you can fill with different opportunities, and also you can structure it so that you increase the independence quotient as the year moves on. So what can you do on a gap year? What are the actual things that I'm talking about? There are, again, I think that it's helpful to have a framing of the types of opportunities, because then you can really get a sense of what's out there. But I also want you to know that a gap year is not confined to these 8 categories either. It really can be completely self-designed based on your own situation as well. But I do want to give you some kind of something to grab onto as far as like the different types of things. So this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about all the cool things that you can do on a gap year. So first of all, volunteering and service. I think that this is a fantastic way to spend part or all of your gap year, because you gain skills, you develop cultural competency, you get to meet other people. Sometimes if you're doing volunteering out of the country, you get to see and experience a new culture or learn a language. So it really is a fantastic way to spend some time. The cool thing about volunteering is that you can often find ways to volunteer that really leverage a student's natural skill set. So if they like working with kids, there are education projects and childcare projects that you can engage in, where you can really help out a community and plug into somewhere that really wants some more human capital. If you're interested in conservation or wildlife, there are so many cool opportunities. I have students who go and work with sea turtles in Costa Rica, who work with monkeys in South Africa, who go and do field research in Peru, who get to work in our national parks on trail building projects. So there are really a lot of cool opportunities in this category, whether you want to work with people and do community development projects, or whether you want to focus on environmental work, working with animals, that kind of thing. There's also, a huge opportunity with national service, Americorps. So a lot of people understand Americorps as the domestic arm of the Peace Corps, but a lot of people don't realize that gap year students and people with their GED or college or high school diploma are actually eligible for many Americorps opportunities. And many students who take a gap year choose to do national service in the form of City Year is a good example, or NCCC. These are both 10-month-long programs where you work in communities. City Year is more of a teaching, mentoring program in urban environments, and NCCC tends to be more environmental and community development work and building projects. So these are fully funded opportunities. You get an education award that you can put towards college at the end of your service. And they're just very, very accessible and fantastic skill building opportunities that you can do right here in your own country, which is fantastic. If you do want to travel and see the world, there are many, many gap year opportunities where you can volunteer in other countries as well. And and they also tend to be quite affordable as well, even if you're going to other places. So interning we often think of interning as, your buddy has a company and maybe your young adult can intern with them and get some experience, and that is a great way of doing it. And if you have some relationships with people who are of interest to you or your young adult, leverage those, right? Sometimes I often recommend that students do what we call a resource map. Who do you know here locally as well as further afield who might be able to house your young person or connect them with a cool opportunity? And interning is really one way to get that kind of good career experience. If you don't have anybody in your network that fits that bill, there are actually internship programs that you can join where you can get linked up with your own internship placement, and the internship company will also provide housing. Usually it's with other young people who are doing internships. So that's a really cool way to get some black and white text on your resume. Really, really good opportunities. My student Sam, who's in the picture here, is actually at an internship program in Massachusetts, and he's been doing he spent most of his fall or all of the fall at this auto body shop because he's really interested in going into that vocation. Second half of his year, he started there, and he's going to finish by doing like a tech, some sort of IT computer related internship. So completely different industry. So when he comes out of his gap year, he will have not only 2 really high quality internships on his resume, but also the knowledge of like what each of those industries look like before he makes the decision about what college is going to look like for him, or vocational training if he goes that route. Courses. Courses tend to be shorter opportunities where you're building out a specific skill set. So these typically are not for credit, although you can sometimes get credit on your gap year that you can then put towards different colleges, or sometimes offset gen ed requirements and stuff like that. But usually with courses, they're for students who really want to do one thing or another because they're interested in it. So they might want to learn how to, sculpt in Italy, or they might want to learn how to build a boat in Maine, or learn how to scuba dive, or gain a certification for coding. So many different types of interests can be accommodated through courses, and they can often be found here in the States as well as, all over the place. So if there's a skill that you really want to build on, there's going to be a course for you. Independent projects, this is, if you are a really self-motivated student, or that sounds like your child, a student can actually like self-create a lot of really cool things on their gap year. I had a student this year who actually started his own business with a buddy. It was actually in venture capital. It was a very complicated concept, and it actually didn't work out. But think about that for a second. This kid spent 3 months working on a business plan with his friend. They interviewed really amazing people in the business world, created this, model for what they wanted to do, found out that it wasn't viable, and then he moved on to something else. It was very low risk for him to experiment and try something new and run with this idea. So that is such a cool experience for a young person to have. Tyler, the young woman in this picture, she actually had a COVID gap year this past year. So she was staying closer to home. She had high risk family members, and she decided that she wanted to learn something new every month during her gap year. So she structured her whole gap year so that each month was a different, like, intensive learning opportunity. So she spent a month learning Mandarin, a month writing a one-woman show, all these different things. It was really, really cool. So again, this is for students who really know what they want, or have the imagination and drive to build it out themselves. Now, experiential programs, those are the ones all the way on the bottom left. These are going to be opportunities where you're going to be with a cohort of your peers and moving around a region doing a bunch of different things. So these opportunities tend to be more structured, a little bit more on the more expensive side, because they are more structured and more supported. Typically, they're 10 to 15 gap year students with 2 leaders who are there to kind of facilitate all the logistics and the learning. And they do a bunch of different things. Some are more outdoor focused. So you probably know people who've done things like Outward Bound or Knowles, where they're, learning how to backpack or rock climb. That's one type of this type of program. There are also ones that are more about service learning, where you're actually doing different types of volunteer projects or learning a language. There are ones that are more culturally focused, where it is more focused on taking a deeper dive into that region's culture and learning all about a certain thematic issue. So whether you're an outdoorsy person and really want to get build out that skill set, or if you're into learning about the arts and like learning a language and living with a homestay family, these programs kind of come in different flavors, if you will, but they have these core qualities of being with your other gap year peers, having leaders, and usually moving around to different areas. Now, typically in the past, before COVID, many of these programs were abroad. You could go to East Africa on one of these programs, or the South Pacific, or Latin America. Increasingly, these programs are coming back online, but there's also a slew that are now available in the States. So I had students this fall go on a 2-month, 3-month-long program that focused on the Western United States. So they spent time in Montana, Wyoming, Washington, and Oregon for 3 months as a group doing projects in the national parks. They did, a week of hiking in the Rockies. They monitored whales off the coast of Washington on Orcas Island. So lots of really cool mini projects where they were seeing this whole region of our country. There's also programs that go to Hawaii and which is pretty cool too. So again, you can stay in the States or go further away, but there are lots of projects that or programs that are in that category for gap year students. They typically run about 2 or 3 months in length as well. So working is, I think, a mainstay of a gap year, but crucially, work should be the part of a gap year, not all of it. And by that, I mean, if a student is living at home and working at home, or if a student is close to home and working, then there should be something that they're doing that is a stretch. You know, taking a gap year is not supposed to be the same old, same old. You're supposed to be pushing your comfort zone a little bit. So for example, I have a student who I'm working with this year who is local to Burlington, taking a gap year, was really enjoying working, decided to extend being in the area and keep working, but crucially moved out of her parents' house and got an apartment in South Burlington. And so this whole gap year, she's been in Vermont, and she's worked 2 different jobs, and she's been living independently this whole time. So that was her stretch. So when you're thinking about working on a gap year, think about what else you can be doing. Could you be taking an online course to learn, something like, a Python, or could you be, doing an independent project like a film or something like that to kind of keep your creative juices flowing? Like, what else can you do to keep expanding and checking off the boxes for your gap year goals? But working is a crucial component of most gap years, and most students do work at some point during their gap year. So this year also virtual programs became very popular. So a lot of students will do virtual programs that are career related. So there are career accelerator courses, there are virtual internships that you can do, and there are other types of virtual volunteering and virtual courses that are not like what you've done in high school and, and are much more experiential, much more conversation based, much more project based. So I know that the idea of virtual can freak a lot of students out when it comes to what you could do on your gap year, but I would think of it as like an add-on experience. So this is like, again, an example of what you could do if you were working at home. Maybe you also do a virtual internship for a company that's in Barcelona, which actually I have a student doing that very thing this spring. He's doing an internship. He's going to be living at home, but he's going to be matched with a company that's in Barcelona. So there are lots of ways to leverage the fact that we live in this kind of boundless world virtually now. And lastly, travel. Travel is a really important part of a gap year because there's a freedom in it, there's independence in it, and there's kind of the testing of those boundaries and the ability to make decisions for yourself. Now, there should be obviously parameters around how travel works on a gap year, depending on the family. But for instance, this year I've had a lot of students do things like road trips. 2 of my students here in Stowe, in the fall, they spent 2 months driving out west, seeing friends, doing some climbing, seeing national parks, staying at Airbnb, so they were socially distanced from other people, and they had a great time. And it was such a amazing opportunity for them to get out of Vermont when we all felt a little bit claustrophobic, and see a little bit when they had the time and the space to do so. And as we move into the future, travel is looking a lot more possible and positive. So there are going to be more opportunities for students to do more independent travel, both here in the States and internationally, as time moves along. So before I move on to, well, let's see what my next slide is. Oh yeah, so I wanted to go through a couple student profiles. But before I do that, it's not going backwards for some reason, it's going forwards. Hold on a second, there we go. I just wanted to touch on COVID for a second, because I know that a lot of families probably are wondering, what does a gap year even mean as we are coming out of a global pandemic? And I will say that I've been very impressed by gap year programs and how they have responded to COVID and how they have been able to pivot, both by, sometimes pulling out of countries that didn't make sense, and recreating programs here in America that have been able to run, and by also creating protocols, testing protocols, and creating pods for gap year students so that they can do things like rock climb in Colorado safely. Or, there's a program in New Hampshire that is based on a farm, and you live on the farm and work together and learn together. And it's pretty safe because the students quarantine ahead of arrival. They are, kind of cut off from the outside world, but they're together when they're on program, and they are able to mitigate a lot of risk that way. This spring, most of my students were in the country last fall, but this spring I have students now in Costa Rica, in the Bahamas, in South Africa, in Ireland, in Israel, in Ecuador. So in addition to being all over the States as well. So there are actually quite a few places that are, able to accommodate American travelers safely, and I do say safely in the, when we're mitigating risk, obviously safety cannot be guaranteed, but it can be, it is not impossible to travel in the era of COVID and do it responsibly. So as we move through the next couple months, vaccine passports are probably going to be something that will be able to be utilized for young people who are, vaccinated age to be able to travel. And then as we move forward into the future, obviously, hopefully things only get better and better from there. So as you kind of got a preview of, I also wanted to just touch on a couple gap year student stories, because this is really where you can see how a gap year works in practical terms. So this student, Michelle, she was self-funding her gap year, meaning that her parents were supportive but not financially backing her gap year. So she worked and saved leading up to her gap year, and then she had a very low-cost gap year in practice. She also got a scholarship to put towards her gap year expenses. So she really, her gap year goals were to become fluent in Spanish and to get experience in the international nonprofit space. So she worked at a language school, or she spent time, 3 months at a language school in Guatemala in the fall of her gap year. Then she came home for the holidays, and then she went and spent 5 months in Mexico volunteering and interning at a women's microfinance cooperative in Oaxaca, Mexico. And she ended her gap year with about 6 weeks of solo travel in Colombia and Peru. So she did all of that on her own dime. And, she was also quite an independent young woman who had had some travel experiences under her belt. So this is just an example of how someone can actually execute a really low cost gap year that still sounds and is pretty amazing. So Andre is an example of a national service alum. Andre grew up in New Orleans and decided that he wanted to take his gap year to give back to the people of New Orleans. So he applied for City Year NOLA and spent 10 months embedded in an under-resourced school, mentoring the students, helping keep students in school, giving students reading help and that kind of thing. And he had a really powerful experience. He actually ended up extending his time into 2 years of service. So that's a really good example of a national service opportunity. Then we have Lily. So Lily is definitely our adventurer type. She really wanted to go like as far away as possible from the Northeast. And she did an experiential semester in the South Pacific, doing different types of service projects in conservation and community development. Came home for the holidays, went back to Southeast Asia for the second part of her gap year, spending about 3 months volunteering in Thailand at a school. She was assisting with English teaching. And then she ended her gap year with this was her big dream for her gap year. She really wanted to learn how to surf. And she ended up going to 4 weeks of surf camp in Sri Lanka. So her gap year was in 2018, 2019, which is why this was all kind of on the table, which is hopefully what we're going to be able to see for students in a year or two as well. So, I think that the thing about Lily was that she really wanted to do a lot, and her parents were a little they wanted to make sure that she was doing it safely and in the right order. So her gap year really started with this highly structured 3-month program where she was with leaders and peers and learning how to travel and doing it in a way that was really expanding her mind as well. And then she kind of ratcheted up the independence as the year went along, ending with the most independent opportunity, which was traveling in Sri Lanka. And we also have Jeremy. Jeremy is a great example of somebody who had a lot of passion around social and environmental issues and spent his gap year really dedicated to his own values. So he did most of his gap year with the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth-led climate change activist community. He lived in Pennsylvania and was working on the midterm elections in 2018 when he took his gap time. So he was doing door knocking. He was involved in local politics. He was on the road doing tours to talk about the Green New Deal. So he got a, like master's degree in politics on his gap year. But when he wasn't working with the Sunrise Movement, he was also working in a bookshop. He did his birthright trip to Israel during his gap time, and he ended his gap year with work stays. So woofing is a type of gap year opportunity where you can actually exchange your labor for room and board on farms and bed and breakfast and other places. He woofed in California, but you can actually do these work exchanges all over the world. It's really, really neat. And it's a very low cost way of traveling because you're kind of doing a straight exchange with a host who's willing to kind of take you in. And there are platforms that allow you to find hosts and get to know each other before committing and things like that, so you can mitigate that unknown. And so then he also traveled a bit on the West Coast after woofing. So he also had a very low cost gap year, very much bootstrapped without the help of a lot of structured programs, but still had an incredibly meaningful time. So I want to take a moment to kind of talk about the process of integrating a gap year into a four-year college plan. I know that won't be everybody's situation on this call, but I think that it's important to kind of understand how to weave in a gap year to a four-year college plan. So really the best situation that you can put yourself in if you want to go to college after your gap time is to apply for college regular as you would senior year of high school, wait for the spring to hear back from colleges, and then defer admission from your top school of choice. So deferring admission basically means you formally request that the school hold your spot for a year so that you can take your gap year and arrive a year later to that same institution. And a lot of colleges are deferral friendly because they know that gap years can be very beneficial to students. So typically most colleges have a process. So you can call up the admissions office, say, what is your deferral policy? They'll say, we want you to write a letter, or we want you to fill out this form. And then once you're admitted, you put down a deposit at the school of choice, you go through the deferral process, and then they hold your spot until the following year. So during your gap time, you maintain communications with your contact person at that college. And then you also want to make sure that you reapply for FAFSA if that's something that's, pertains to you. And also when it comes to merit aid and other types of, in-house scholarships and things like that, sometimes those defer and sometimes they will hold your entire financial package for a whole year. And other times they will make you reapply for some or all of it. So really a lot of this is case by case basis that you have to kind of go through as it comes up. And then, basically the only reason I will tell a young person not to do a gap year is if they get an extraordinary financial aid package that won't defer. That is pretty much the only situation in which I will say a student should not take a gap year. So if you want to go to a college that is not deferral friendly, but you get in as a senior, sometimes that college will kind of wink at you and say, just apply again, and we'll accept you again. Other colleges will not make that kind of informal agreement, but it is very common that a student will get in a second time if they get in the first time and if they're made to reapply. So if you have follow-up questions about any of the deferral stuff, please, we can definitely address that in the Q&A, which is coming up fast. So this is just, I wanted to kind of wind down with quotes from students and quotes from parents. I won't read all of them, but I think that one of the things I hear time and time again from students and their parents who choose to do gap time is that they can't imagine not having done it, and that they can't imagine they don't really understand why it was even a decision that they were wavering on the year before. So this is the true conundrum that I face as a gap year counselor and someone who gets to see people through this amazing process, is that it's kind of confusing as to why more people don't automatically opt into it, because it is such an incredible experience. But it is a little bit of, as you saw, it's a little bit of a different planning process. It can be a little bit intimidating to do something that not all your friends are doing. So those are the biggest barriers that I see. It's not the financial barriers, because a gap year can be very affordable. And it's not the college barriers, because many colleges will actually accept deferrals. So the barrier is really the internal barrier of a student not knowing what a gap year could look like for them, or parents not being able to picture what a gap year looks like, and if it will be successful. So hopefully some of that was demystified during tonight's presentation. So lastly, just some resources for you all. I'm very easy to find. So, we're all local here to Vermont, I think. So you're welcome to, connect with me virtually. And then someday very soon, I'll be able to see people in person again, which would be delightful. I also co-host a podcast called Gap Year Radio, which you can find on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, wherever you find podcasts. And my co-host and I interview gap year alums. And that is an excellent way, especially for parents on the call who want to introduce this idea to your young person, that, have them talk to students. They don't want to hear from us. They want to hear from the students, and they want to hear their stories. So the podcast is a great way to get them to hear from their own peers. The Gap Year Association is an excellent resource to find program listings, to find a gap year planning guide, to find college deferral policies, lots of information on that website. USA Gap Year Fairs is actually having a virtual fair this weekend. So if you go to usagapyearfairs.org, you can actually register for a virtual gap year fair and see different programs. And there'll be a gap year counselor like me doing a presentation. So that's a cool opportunity if you really want to learn about the individual programs I mentioned. And then Service Year Alliance is a very user-friendly listing of national service opportunities. Americorps is kind of notorious for not being very search friendly. So I like to recommend Service Year Alliance, which is just serviceyear.org for looking for Americorps opportunities. I'm going to drop some information in the chat. The first thing you'll see is the first thing you'll see is the scholarship link for a $10,000 gap year scholarship that is live online now through a website called Go Overseas. And then you'll also find all of my contact information on social media and my email and things like that. So you're always welcome to get in touch that way. And I think that I've left just enough time for a couple questions. So Anna, do you want to field the questions, or how do you want to do that?
Sure, it does. It looks like we do have one question in the chat. Maybe we could start with that one. The question was, can you talk more about the wanderer student with neurological differences? And then maybe after that one, I can allow people to unmute too, if anyone wants to ask questions that way.
Sure, yeah, and I think that neurodiversity can run through any of those student profiles for sure. So I think that that's definitely something to look at. So depending on, what their particular, gifts and challenges are, there's going to be a gap year program for them. I think that part of a gap year is actually, part of the refreshing thing is being able to find your tribe a little bit. So I know about, for example, an organization in Massachusetts, I think it's called Intelligent Labs or IntelligiLabs, but they focus on giving students with, on the spectrum and other types of challenges, like an opportunity to just tinker. They have a gap year program where you go and create stuff, both, intellectually stimulating as well as just hands-on learning and project-based learning, which can be really great for those kinds of students. So that's just one example, and I'm happy to talk offline if there's more specifics that you have questions on.
That's great, thanks. And we did have another question come in through the chat. It says, do you find that any colleges offer a semester deferral instead of a whole year?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of colleges will have on their application am I open to a Feb or a Jan admission? And you can check that box when you apply. Once you are into a college, it is very hard to actually just request one semester, but you can do that if you're already a current student. So you can request a leave of absence for a semester, but as a gap year student, you usually have to commit to a whole year unless they have a Jan or a Feb admit program, in which case they will sometimes allow students to start, second semester freshman.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and change it so that people, if you do want to unmute yourself to ask a question, folks can do it that way. Maybe if anyone wants to ask a question that way, if you could raise your hand and then we could call on you so that there's some structure. Also feel free to keep typing questions in the chat. And before folks start to drop off, I did just want to remind everyone that we are doing weekly contests as part of this year's College and Career Pathways, and you get an entry for each one of these live events that you attend. So make sure to enter that. We're giving away Visa gift cards each week. So I put that link in the chat as well for y'all. But yeah, any other questions? We would love to. We have a few more minutes here.
Maybe my presentation was so comprehensive that they're all experts now.
I have a question. This is Alicia.
Hi.
Hi. So Julia, you do individual counseling, it sounds like, for students
Yes.
on a gap year. So what does that look like? Is that something that my daughter, who's now in 11th grade, wouldn't take on until next year? Is there a cost associated with it? How much time do you spend working with them? What does that process look like?
Oh yeah, that's such a good question, Alicia. So yes, I do offer individualized counseling for students. And usually that runs, I do have hourly packages and things like that, but with most of my students, I actually work from around, second semester, senior year, from there through the end of their gap time. So I'm working with students usually for about, 14 to 18 months in the preparation of their gap year and then the execution of it. So it's a lot of fun. I have different packages available, which you can, my website is in the chat, I believe I dropped it in there. Yep, it's just enroutegapyear.com. So you're welcome to kind of poke around on there and see the service page, which is pretty comprehensive. But I would say that you can wait to get in touch with me until senior year, but I do offer free introductory conversations for any family who just wants to brainstorm, learn more about gap year opportunities. And so you're more than welcome to take advantage of that, whether or not you want to, become a formal client.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And if anybody has, questions that arise as you kind of internalize all of this information, feel free to shoot me an email or follow me on Instagram. That's probably my most active social media channel. I'm always posting information and linking to other events and stuff like that. So that's another great place to connect if you just want to stay a little bit in touch as you, investigate all these college and career options for you or your young person.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you everyone for being here. This session was recorded, so it'll be up on our website within the next day or two, which is vsac.org/ccp. And I can put that link in the chat as well. And we do have a number of other sessions going on throughout the month, so hopefully we will see some of you there. But thanks again.
So much fun. Thank you so much for spending some of your evening with me.